What really happened today? A mother vanished from a quiet beach picnic, leaving only her sandals mysteriously facing the shore. Dive into this chilling story of secrets, suspense, and the ocean's haunting pull. Stay with us till the last wave to uncover the truth. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable mysteries. The air smelled of brine and heat that day, an odd, heavy combination that clung to the back of the throat. It was Sunday, August 11th, 2002, a date the Whitmore family would never again speak without the weight of silence following. The tide was low at Crescent Bay Beach, the kind of low that left slick trails of kelp and small, glistening pools where crabs skittered. The sea was calm, glassy even, reflecting a sun that seemed too bright for the hour. They had arrived just after 9 in the morning, before the beach filled with the noise of strangers. Henry Whitmore, always punctual to a fault, parked their navy blue station wagon in the gravel lot near the dunes. His wife, Claire, stepped out on the passenger side, shielding her eyes with her hand even though she already had her sunglasses on. She was dressed simply, white cotton blouse, faded denim shorts, a straw hat that shadowed her face. Their daughters, 15-year-old Sophie and 11-year-old Megan, tumbled out of the back seat with the unrestrained energy of youth, each carrying a towel almost as big as they were. Claire carried the wicker picnic basket, while Henry slung a folded umbrella over his shoulder and dragged a cooler across the sand. The walk toward the shoreline was slow, the grains sinking under their sandals. It was Sophie who noticed her mother pause halfway, leaning slightly to one side, as though listening to something far off. "What is it, Mom?" Sophie had asked, but Claire just shook her head and kept walking. They set up their spot near a natural crescent of rocks where the sand dipped lower. Henry planted the umbrella, the girls spread the towels, and Claire began unpacking the basket with her usual care, stacking the sandwiches neatly, lining up the bottles of water, setting the watermelon in a covered bowl as though it were the centerpiece of some small ceremony. Around 10:20 a.m., Claire removed her sandals. They were light tan leather, the straps worn soft from years of use. She set them carefully on the damp sand, facing the ocean, the toes angled slightly outward as though she just stepped out of them mid-stride. She told Henry she was going to walk a bit, her tone casual, almost offhand, but her eyes lingered on the horizon in a way that didn't match her voice. Henry barely looked up from adjusting the umbrella. "Don't go too far. Tide'll turn in an hour." She didn't answer, just smiled faintly and started toward the water. The girls were playing a game of racing the retreating waves, shrieking as the foam licked at their ankles. Sophie glanced at her mother once, Claire standing knee-deep, the hem of her shorts darkening with seawater, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. The expression on her face was unreadable from that distance. It was Megan who realized first that something was wrong. She'd been digging in the wet sand with a plastic spade when she looked up and saw that her mother was no longer there. "Dad, where's Mom?" Henry looked toward the shore. The sandals were still there, placed neatly as before, but the space beyond them was empty. No figure in the shallows. No movement in the water. At first, he assumed she had waded farther down the beach. He stood, scanning the shoreline. Nothing. A handful of strangers wandered the sand in the opposite direction, but no one resembled Claire. The calm tone he tried to keep when he told the girls to stay began to crack when he walked 50 yards in each direction and saw no sign of her. The first real jolt of fear came when he waded into the water himself, calling her name. His voice carried across the still surface, but no answer came back, only the rhythmic hush of waves breaking against the shore. He kept telling himself she'd simply gone for a walk, that she'd return any moment, smiling, perhaps holding a shell she'd found. But the minutes stretched, and her absence began to feel wrong. By 10:37 a.m., Henry's calls had turned into shouts, his head whipping from side to side. The girls were standing now, frozen in place, eyes wide. He flagged down a couple nearby, asking if they'd seen a woman. White blouse, denim shorts, straw hat. They shook their heads, glancing toward the water with that mixture of curiosity and unease that strangers were when someone else's emergency unfolds in front of them. When Henry returned to their picnic spot, The sandals seemed different somehow. Still neatly placed, still facing the water, but now they looked deliberate, as if someone had set them there for others to find. The lifeguards arrived within minutes after he alerted the beach patrol. Radios crackled with clipped instructions. One scanned the water with binoculars, the other jogged toward the rocks at the far end of the bay. Sophie and Megan clung to each other, tears sliding down their faces, while Henry tried to answer the lifeguard's questions through a throat that felt too tight. Had she been upset? Had she said anything strange that morning? Did she have a history of depression? No, and no. They searched the shallows, then farther out, forming a line and moving methodically through the water. The sea remained calm, indifferent. Divers were called in from the next town over, arriving just after noon. They found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not the straw hat, nothing floating, nothing caught in the rocks. Reporters began showing up by early afternoon, tipped off by police scanners. Their cameras lingered on the sandals, zoomed in on the empty picnic blanket. A photo would later appear on the front page of the Windmere Chronicle. The two tan sandals side by side, the incoming tide just touching their heels. By the time the sun began to drop, the beach had emptied. The search continued into the night, floodlights casting cold white cones over the darkened water. Henry and the girls stayed until an officer gently told them there was nothing more to be done until morning. That night, in the small rental cabin they'd taken for the weekend, the silence was unbearable. Sophie lay awake listening to her father pacing the kitchen. Megan cried until she hiccuped, asking over and over why they hadn't found her mother. In the days that followed, the search widened. Boats scanned miles of coastline. Helicopters swept the shore. Flyers went up in every shop window from Windmere to the next county. No one could explain how a woman could vanish in broad daylight from a calm beach, leaving only her sandals behind. Theories multiplied, each stranger than the last. She'd been swept out by an undercurrent no one else felt. She'd run away. She'd been taken. But none of them fit perfectly. And every night, Henry dreamed of the sandals, facing the shore as if she had come from a sea rather than gone into it. The second week after Claire's disappearance felt less like time passing and more like an airless room the family couldn't leave. Henry stopped going to work. His employer had called twice in the first 3 days, leaving stiff, polite voicemails offering personal leave, but by day 7 no one asked anymore. The police told him they'd keep the case open and active, but their tone carried the slow sag of doubt. The morning after the beach search officially ended, Henry sat at the kitchen table, staring at a map of Crescent Bay printed off in faded ink. He had circled the rocky inlets, drawn arrows toward the coves where the divers had searched, marked red X's where the currents might carry debris. Sophie found him there, unshaven, the smell of stale coffee hanging between them. "She's not gone," he muttered, as if that alone could undo the emptiness. The police interviews grew repetitive. Each time, Henry described the sandals, how Claire had placed them so deliberately, toes facing the water. Detective Ian Kershaw would write something in his notebook, always too slow, as though he were trying to stretch the silence. "Could be symbolic," Kershaw said once, glancing up at Henry. "Or it could mean nothing," Henry snapped. "You ever think of that? Maybe she just took them off to walk in the water like anyone else." The detective didn't argue, but Henry saw it in his eyes, how the theory of voluntary disappearance was beginning to take root. The girls reacted differently. Sophie turned inward, spending hours in her room with the blinds drawn, earbuds in, writing in a notebook she kept hidden under a mattress. Megan, too young to barricade herself in silence, asked constant questions. Where was Mom now? Was she in the water? Was she hurt? Would she be back by Friday? Henry never knew what to say, and his hesitation became an answer all its own. On the 10th day, Henry began his own search. He borrowed a small motorboat from a friend in the harbor, stocking it with binoculars, a flashlight, and a thermos of black coffee. He worked the coastline at dawn and again just before dusk, scanning every jagged line of rock, every floating scrap of seaweed, every piece of driftwood that might, at a distance, resemble the curve of a human arm. News crews returned intermittently, hungry for updates that never came. They replayed the same images. Henry standing on the sand, the girls clinging to his sides, the two tan sandals still hauntingly aligned at the tide's edge. Some nights, Henry watched the footage on mute, as if by removing the sound he could force the images to give up a detail he'd missed before. By the third week, whispers had begun around town. People in the grocery store lowered their voices when Henry passed. Someone had said they'd seen Claire talking to a man near the dunes earlier that morning. No one could describe him clearly. Another swore they'd heard she had debts, though no proof ever surfaced. The most insidious theory, murmured behind closed doors, was that she'd simply chosen to walk away from her life. Henry's mother-in-law, Margaret, arrived from Portland at the end of August. She was brittle with grief, her hands always busy, folding laundry that wasn't dirty, scrubbing countertops that didn't need it. She and Henry argued in hushed, sharp voices late at night. She thought he wasn't pressing the police hard enough. He thought she was filling the girls' heads with false hope. Autumn came early that year. By September, the wind off the bay had turned sharp, and the water took on a darker, oilier sheen. Henry's searches grew shorter as the days shortened, but he refused to stop. The police had nothing new. The flyers faded on their corners, curling under the damp air, and were replaced less frequently. One morning in mid-October, Henry received a call from Detective Kershaw. A fisherman about 40 miles south had found a straw hat tangled in a line of seaweed. It matched the description of Claire's. Henry drove down without telling the girls, his hands locked so tightly on the wheel that his knuckles whitened. The hat was hers. Same weave, same small tear along the brim from where Sophie had once stepped on it during a picnic. But the salt water had stiffened it, discolored it. Henry held it like something fragile and dangerous, trying to imagine the currents that could have carried it so far without bringing anything else with it. No other item, no shirt, no shorts, no body, was found. That winter was the first in which the Whitmore home felt less like a house and more like a mausoleum for a life half-lived. The Christmas tree went up late and came down early. Megan stopped asking her daily questions. Sophie stopped coming downstairs for dinner at all. Henry began drinking, not heavily at first, but enough that the sharpness in his mind dulled, enough that he could pass an evening without the Sandals and the tide replaying in his head. The following year, the case was still open, but it had shifted to the cold files desk. Henry called once a week, and each time the answer was the same: nothing new. The Sandals remained in a cardboard box in the back of Henry's closet, wrapped in a dish towel, as if keeping them from the dust could somehow preserve the moment before everything had gone wrong. By 2006, the girls no longer referred to their mother in the present tense. By 2008, Henry stopped calling the police altogether. And yet, every August 11th, he returned to Crescent Bay at the exact hour she vanished, standing on the sand with the wind in his face, staring at the place where two sandals once pointed toward the horizon. It would be 10 more years before anything new surfaced. But when it did, it would shift every certainty Henry thought he had about that day and about who his wife really was. It was the summer of 2018 when the first crack appeared in the sealed surface of the past. 16 years had passed since the morning Claire vanished, and the absence had calcified into a kind of silent agreement within the family. No one spoke of her unless necessary, and even then, it was done with the careful distance one uses for describing the weather. Sophie was 31 now, working as a paramedic in Seattle. Megan, 27, lived in Portland with her fiancé. Henry remained in Windermere, in the same weather-worn house, carrying the same routines like a burden he couldn't put down. The day began like any other for Henry. Coffee before sunrise, a slow walk to the pier, then back home to spend the morning fixing what didn't need fixing. At 10:14 a.m., his phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something, an inexplicable pressure in his chest, made him answer. The voice on the other end was low, slightly distorted, and entirely unfamiliar. "You're looking in the wrong place," the caller said. Henry froze. "Who is this?" The Sandals weren't left by her. Before Henry could respond, the line went dead. He stood in the kitchen for several minutes, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. It could have been a prank. God knows people had played them before. But there was a precision to the statement that unsettled him. Whoever it was hadn't said your wife or Claire. They'd said her, like someone speaking about a person they'd known. By noon, he was at the Windermere Police Department, sitting across from Detective Marla Ruiz, who had taken over cold cases 2 years prior. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but attentive. "You're certain the voice was disguised?" she asked. "Yes, but they knew things." Ruiz tapped her pen against the notepad. Could be someone who followed the case back then. The sandals were in every news photo. They said they weren't hers. "That's a new one," Ruiz admitted. "But without a number to trace, we can't do much. If they call again, record it." Henry left feeling dismissed, though Ruiz's eyes had narrowed slightly at that final detail. He knew she was curious, even if procedure kept her from chasing shadows. 3 weeks later, a small article appeared in the Windermere Chronicle. A storm earlier that month had shifted a sandbank just north of Crescent Bay, revealing a piece of driftwood tangled with fishing line. Lodged between the wood and a rock was a waterproof pouch. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film. The article barely made a ripple. No one connected it to Claire, not publicly, but Henry couldn't ignore the timing. He called Ruiz, and she confirmed the police had taken possession of the pouch. The film was being developed at a lab. She wouldn't say more. 2 days later, Ruiz called him in. The photos were sun-bleached, edges warped by time and moisture, but some were clear enough. Most were typical, blurry shots of the beach, a child holding a kite, a man grilling near the dunes. But one frame made Henry's throat close. It showed the exact stretch of Crescent Bay where they'd picnicked that day in 2002. In the center of the frame stood a woman in a white blouse and denim shorts. She was turned slightly away from the camera, but her profile was unmistakable, Claire. She wasn't alone. Just behind her, partially obscured by the curve of her body, was a man in a dark windbreaker. His head was tilted toward hers as if speaking into her ear. The strange thing was Claire's shoulders were stiff, her arms close to her sides, not the relaxed stance Henry knew. "Do you know him?" Ruiz asked. Henry shook his head. The man's face was in shadow, his features indistinct. The timestamp in the photo's corner read 10:19 a.m. Less than a minute before Sophie had last seen her mother standing in the water. Henry stared at the image until the room seemed to shrink around him. 16 years, and suddenly there was proof that she hadn't been alone before she vanished. That night, he pulled the cardboard box from his closet and unwrapped the sandals. He placed them on the floor exactly as they'd been on the beach, facing the shore. He crouched down, staring at the scuffed straps, the slight indentation of her toes in the leather. If they weren't hers, as the caller claimed, then whose were they? And why would someone go to the trouble of placing them there? 2 days later, the phone rang again. Same blocked number. Same low, distorted voice. "You're starting to see it," the caller said. Henry gripped the phone until his knuckles ached. "Who are you? What happened to my wife?" "She didn't walk into the sea. The sea was the excuse." The line went dead again. And for the first time in years, Henry felt the old panic returning. Not the dull ache of absence, but the sharp, bright fear of something unfinished. The rain came hard the next morning, turning Windermere streets into slick ribbons of black. Henry sat in his car outside the bungalow again, the wipers struggling to keep up. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's profile in that photograph. The man leaning toward her, the look on her face that wasn't fear exactly, but something close. By 8:42 a.m., the man emerged. He wore a navy raincoat, hood up, and carried a small duffel. Henry's pulse quickened. This was it, no more watching from a distance. He stepped out of the car and crossed the street before he could think better of it. "Hey," Henry called. The man stopped, turned slowly. Up close, the years had deepened the lines in his face, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "You were at Crescent Bay," Henry said, the rain seeping into his collar. "August 11th, 2002. You were with my wife." For a long moment, the man didn't answer. Then he said, "You shouldn't be here. I'm not leaving until you tell me what happened." The man's gaze flicked up and down the street, as though checking for someone else. Do you really want to know? Henry took a step closer. I've been waiting 16 years. The man sighed, shifted the duffel on his shoulder. I didn't take her. I tried to stop her. That stopped Henry cold. Stop her from what? But the man shook his head. Not here. He scribbled an address on a damp receipt and shoved it into Henry's hand. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't bring anyone. Before Henry could press him further, the man walked away, disappearing into the rain like someone who'd done this before. That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table staring at the address. It was a spot on the far edge of town, a shutter bait shop that had been closed since 2005. Something about it felt wrong. He thought about calling Detective Ruiz, but part of him knew if he did, the man would vanish, and with him, whatever truth he carried. The next morning, Henry drove there alone. The bait shop sat hunched against the gray sky, its sign hanging crooked, the parking lot littered with beer bottles and broken shells. The man was waiting inside, standing behind the counter like a shopkeeper from another time. You came, he said without surprise. Start talking, Henry demanded. The man leaned against the counter. Your wife was involved in something. Something she didn't want you to know about. That morning at the beach, she was supposed to meet someone. Not me. I just happened to see it unfold. Henry's stomach tightened. What was it? She was being watched, the man said. Followed. I don't know by who, but I know why the Sandals were there. They were a message. A message to who? To anyone looking for her. To make you think she went into the water. So you'd stop asking questions. Henry gripped the counter. And you just let it happen. The man's eyes hardened. I tried to get her to leave. She wouldn't. Said it was already too late. A sound outside cut him off, the faint crunch of gravel under tires. Both men froze. You were followed, the man said, voice low. A black SUV pulled into the lot, windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing but the pale morning sky. The man's expression changed, fear, sharp and unmasked. Go, he told Henry. Now, and don't come back here. Henry hesitated. Who are they? But the man was already moving toward the back door. The SUV's passenger window slid down just enough for Henry to glimpse the edge of a camera lens. A click, then the window rolled up again. The engine growled. Henry didn't wait to see what would happen next. He got in his car and drove, the rearview mirror filled with the SUV for 6 straight blocks before it finally turned away. When he got home, the address receipt was gone from his pocket. That night, the phone rang again. You've seen too much, the voice said. No distortion this time, just flat calm. Stop now, or you'll wish she'd gone into the sea. The line went dead, leaving Henry in the dark kitchen, the sound of rain on the windows like the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock. The night after the storm felt heavier than any before. The small coastal town seemed suffocated by an invisible weight, as if the air itself knew something terrible was close. People walked quickly, heads down, conversations hushed. Even the fishermen, men who had spent decades braving wild seas, looked uneasy as they tied their boats tightly to the dock, avoiding the gaze of the dark water. It had been 5 days since Mara vanished from the beach picnic. 5 days of search parties combing every inch of the coastline, the forest trails, and the rocky inlets. But now, even the official search teams were beginning to pull back. They claimed it was to regroup resources, but everyone knew what it really meant. They were giving up. Except for me. I couldn't give up. Not when the last image burned into my mind was her sandals in the sand, perfectly placed, toes pointing toward the waves, as if she had stepped into the sea willingly. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at the tide charts, I heard again the faint knocking. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was from the back of the house, near the old cellar. My chest tightened. I grabbed the flashlight and forced myself to follow the sound. The knocking stopped the moment I reached the cellar door. I stood there for nearly a full minute, gripping the handle before I pulled it open. The air inside was damp and cold. The beam of my flashlight swept across the stone walls, the crates, the shelves lined with jars of preserves. Nothing. No one. But as I turned to leave, the beam caught something in the far corner. A piece of white fabric snagged on a nail. I approached slowly. The fabric was thin, torn, and streaked with something dark, seaweed tangled around it like veins. My breath caught. It was the same pattern Mara's sundress had that day, pale white with faint blue flowers. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I showed the scrap to the police. They examined it briefly, then set it aside like it was nothing. Probably just a piece of old clothing that washed in, they said. I wanted to scream. This wasn't just old clothing. I knew it was hers. I could still smell her perfume faintly on it. That evening, I decided I couldn't wait for the police anymore. I needed to go back to the beach alone. I timed it so I'd arrive when the tide was at its lowest, hoping I'd see something the search teams missed. The beach was nearly empty except for the wind and the gulls. The tide had pulled back far, revealing jagged rocks and tide pools. I picked my way across the slippery stones, scanning for any sign. That's when I saw it, a trail of footprints in the wet sand. But they were strange. Too long, too narrow, almost as if they'd been dragged. They led not toward the shore, but out into the water and then simply ended. A sudden movement caught my eye. Just beyond the shallow pools, something pale moved beneath the surface. It wasn't a fish, it was too big, too slow. My heart pounded. I crouched down, leaning closer. The water shifted, and for the briefest moment, I saw her face. Mara. Eyes wide, hair floating around her, mouth open as if she were trying to speak. And then, she was yanked backward into the dark water, vanishing. I froze, unable to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The water where she had been swirled unnaturally, as if something far below was twisting and pulling the current in on itself. I stumbled backward, slipped on the rocks, and crashed to my knees. When I looked up again, the water was calm, the pale shape gone. But something else was there, lodged between two rocks. I reached for it with trembling hands. It was a small, smooth shell, unlike any I'd seen before, black as obsidian, warm to the touch despite the cold air. Carved into its surface was a symbol I didn't recognize, sharp and looping like a knot. I didn't know what it meant then, but I could feel it pulsing faintly in my palm. I should have thrown it back into the sea. I didn't. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time, and from inside the walls. The day after the police pulled the second torn scar from the base of the cliff, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. People no longer came to the shore to watch the investigation. They stayed indoors, whispering through half-open windows, glancing at the ocean as though it might speak back. My own street, normally alive with the shouts of children riding bicycles, was eerily quiet. Even the sea birds seemed to have abandoned the beach. Detective Rowan knocked on my door just after noon. His coat was wet at the cuffs, and there was a hard, sleepless edge to his face. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. "It's about something the tide brought in this morning." The words froze me. What was it? He glanced toward the kitchen, as if needing a place to set his thoughts down. "Not a body," he said, "but something that shouldn't have been in the water." From his coat pocket, he produced a small object wrapped in a clear evidence bag. At first, I thought it was just a lump of driftwood. Then I saw the engraving, tiny, almost worn away. "To Elise, July 1989. It was a charm from a bracelet. My mother had one exactly like it. She'd told me once it was a gift from a friend she'd lost touch with. But she'd never worn it to the beach picnics. At least, I didn't think so. I took a step back. Where did you find this?" Rowan's eyes locked on mine, wedged between the rocks, right where your mother's sandals were. "It's been in the water for a long time, months, maybe years. But here's the thing," he lowered his voice. "There are fine scratches along the edge, consistent with a struggle." A rush of heat moved through me. "So you think someone—" "I think," he interrupted, "that your mother may have been pulled into that water by force. And I think this charm came off in the process." I tried to speak, but the image in my mind was already too vivid. Her laughing, barefoot on the shore, then a hand from nowhere, dragging her under. Rowan left soon after, telling me to keep the discovery between us. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the tide, that relentless sucking rhythm, as if it were trying to speak a name. Around 3 a.m., I got up and went down to the beach myself. The moon was thin, the sand cold under my shoes. The tide was low, pulling back to reveal dark, slippery rocks. That's when I saw it, half buried near the edge of the cliffside. A dark blue hair ribbon, frayed and stiff with salt. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. My mother never wore blue ribbons. But I'd seen this before, once on the wrist of a woman who lived 2 houses away from us back in 2005. Her name was Maeve. Back then, Maeve had been an odd figure in the neighborhood, quiet, almost too quiet. She had a habit of standing at her window for long stretches, watching the shore through binoculars. My mother once mentioned Maeve had seen something after a big storm, but refused to tell the police. Shortly after my mother vanished, Maeve moved away without a word. Now here was her ribbon, sitting on the sand 15 years later. I didn't tell Rowan about it. Not yet. Something deep inside me wanted to follow this thread myself, to see where it would lead without official eyes. The next morning, I went to the town records office. It took hours of digging, but I found an address. Maeve was living 2 towns over, in a weather-beaten house by a marsh. When I drove there that evening, the place felt wrong. Curtains drawn, no sign of life except for a single rocking chair on the porch, moving slightly in the wind. I knocked once, twice. No answer. I was about to leave when I noticed something carved into the porch railing. 2 initials, E.L., my mother's. The next moment, I heard the faint creak of a floorboard inside. Someone was there. I stepped back, the hair ribbon still in my pocket, heart hammering against my ribs. If Maeve had been keeping a secret all these years, then it wasn't just the sea that had swallowed my mother's story. It was people, and I was done letting them hide. The evening air was thick with a silence that pressed in like a shroud as I stood on Maeve's porch, heart pounding, the faint rocking of the chair echoing through the dimming light. Every instinct told me to run, to leave whatever secret lay inside this weathered house alone. But years of unanswered questions, of nightmares and lost hope, rooted me to the spot. I knocked again, louder this time. No answer. The creaking floorboard paused, then resumed, slower, deliberate. I debated whether to call out her name, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I pulled out my phone, fumbled to unlock it, and with trembling fingers snapped a photo of the initials carved into the railing. Yell, so familiar and yet suddenly ominous. Suddenly, the porch door opened a crack. A thin, pale face appeared. Maeve's, eyes sharp, cautious, like a hawk sensing prey. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice rough, almost broken. "I need to talk to you about my mother," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I found your ribbon on the beach." Her eyes flickered with something, fear, recognition, before she stepped back and closed the door softly. But not before muttering, "Come inside." The inside was dim and cluttered, filled with stacks of books, faded photographs, and glass jars filled with strange objects, shells, bones, small stones etched with symbols. The smell was of damp wood and something older, like forgotten memories. Maeve sat heavily on a threadbare armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You want to know what happened?" she said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. She exhaled slowly. "I saw her, the day she vanished." My breath caught. "Where? What did you see?" Maeve's eyes darkened. She wasn't alone, but not with the man you saw in the photo. "Who then?" "A group," she said. "People who've lived along this coast for generations. They watch the sea, and the sea watches them." Her words felt like ice sliding down my spine. "What do you mean?" "They believe the sea takes what it's owed," Maeve said, voice trembling. "Your mother, she knew too much. She found something she shouldn't have, something that upset the balance." I wanted to scream, to demand details, but Maeve held up a hand. "There are things you don't understand, things that can't be explained by police reports or photographs." She reached into a cabinet and pulled out a weather journal, the leather cracked and worn. "She gave this to me the day before she disappeared." I took the journal carefully. The pages were filled with tight handwriting, sketches of symbols like the one on the shell I'd found, and strange references to the tide's secret and the watchers beneath. One entry stood out, dated August 10th, 2002, the day before she vanished. It described a hidden cave beneath the cliffs, accessible only at low tide, filled with ancient carvings and strange artifacts. Claire had written of feeling watched, of shadows moving just beyond the light. Maeve's voice cut through the swirling thoughts. She wanted me to keep it safe, but I was too afraid. Tears welled in my eyes. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because they're still out there, Maeve whispered, and they'll do anything to keep the sea's secret. Suddenly, a sharp knock came at the door. Maeve's face drained of color. It's them, she said, rising unsteadily. You have to leave. Now. I didn't hesitate. Gripping the journal, I fled into the night, the pounding in my chest drowned out only by the crashing waves below. As I reached my car, I glanced back once. The porch light flickered, then went dark, and I knew that whatever secrets the sea held, I was now tangled in its depths, pulled under by truths older and darker than anyone in Windmere dared imagine. The wind whipped sharply across the coastline as I sped away from Maeve's house, clutching Claire's journal like a lifeline. The dark clouds overhead seemed to press down, threatening to smother the fragile flicker of hope that had sparked inside me. I knew that whatever they were, those watchers Maeve spoke of, they weren't just figments of folklore or paranoia. They were real, and they had been watching us all along. Back in Windmere, the house felt colder than ever. Henry's tired eyes barely registered when I walked in. Sophie, too, seemed to shrink into herself, weighed down by years of grief and silence. Megan avoided looking at me, as if the journal was a burning coal I might drop at any moment. At dinner, the silence stretched between us, heavier than the storm outside. I finally broke it. I found something, I said, voice shaking. Something about Mom. A journal. It talks about a cave beneath the cliffs and people watching the sea. Henry's fork paused midway to his mouth. Sophie's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting shadows to crawl inside. Megan's fingers twitched against her plate. People watching the sea, Henry repeated. What does that even mean? Maeve told me she saw Mom the day she disappeared. Not just with that man in the photo, but with a secret group that believes the sea takes what it's owed. Sophie finally spoke, her voice brittle. Are you saying Mom got caught up in some cult? Some old superstition? I wanted to say no. I wanted to convince them this was something else entirely, a deeper mystery. But the truth tangled with the fear in my throat. That night, I sat alone in my room reading the journal under the dim light. The entries grew darker, more frantic. Claire had described symbols carved into the rocks, symbols Maeve had in jars. Ancient and unrecognizable, but full of meaning. One passage chilled me. They come with the tide, waiting for the reckoning. I fear I've seen what I should not, and now the sea calls me home. Sleep eluded me. Outside, the ocean's roar was a constant, pulsing heartbeat. The next morning, Henry received a letter. It arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope with no return address, the paper thick and textured as if from an earlier century. Inside was a single page, typed in an old-fashioned font. You seek what is not meant to be found. Leave the past buried beneath the waves. Your family's peace depends on silence. Asterisk. Beneath the words, a small symbol was stamped in black ink, the same knot-like carving from the shell. Henry's hands trembled as he showed it to us. Fear was etched deep into his face, but beneath it lay something else. A determination hardened by years of unanswered questions. We can't ignore this, he said quietly. Whatever they are, whoever sent this, they want us to stop. But stopping felt impossible now. That day, I returned to the beach, journal in hand, searching for the cave Claire wrote about. The tide was low, revealing a narrow crevice hidden behind jagged rocks. Heart pounding, I squeezed through the gap, the salty air thick with damp earth and moss. Inside the cave, ancient carvings spiraled along the walls, symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of my flashlight. The air was cool and smelled of brine and something metallic like blood. I ran my fingers over a carving shaped like a knot. A sudden chill ran through me. From deeper in the cave came a faint sound, a whispering like voices carried on the tide. I froze. "Who's there?" I called. Only silence answered. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a small wooden box tucked into a hollow. Inside were faded photographs, images of women and men standing at the water's edge, sandals placed deliberately in the sand, toes pointing to the sea. Each photo had a date scrawled on the back. They spanned decades: 1932, 1957, 1978, 1994. I swallowed hard, understanding for the first time that Claire's disappearance was not an isolated event but part of a cycle. Something ancient, something sinister. Back at home, tensions frayed as the weight of our discoveries settled in. Sophie refused to speak to me for days, retreating into silence. Megan clung to Henry, their shared fear knitting them together. Henry himself seemed to age before my eyes, the spark in his gaze dimming. Late one night, Henry confided in me. "I thought finding her would bring peace," he said, voice hollow. "But it's only brought more questions. And now, I'm afraid we're all marked." The next morning, the phone rang again. A voice colder than the sea in winter spoke clearly. "You are trespassing on sacred waters. The tide takes all debts. Beware the reckoning." Asterisk. The line went dead. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. We had to act. Together, we gathered what evidence we could. The journal, the photographs, the letters, the shell with its carved symbol. We reached out to a historian at the local university who specialized in coastal folklore. His eyes widened as he examined the items. "This symbol," he said, "is linked to an ancient maritime society that believed in a debt to the sea. Offerings were made, sometimes sacrifices. It's a dark chapter no one here talks about." Our town's history suddenly loomed like a shadow over us. Claire had stumbled into something much bigger than a disappearance, something tied to generations of secrets and fear. As the pieces came together, I realized the past was not done with us. The sea had called Claire home, yes, but the call wasn't finished. And now, neither were we. The weeks after the historian's revelation became a blur of unease and restless nights. The tide seemed to whisper threats, the ocean's dark fingers reaching closer with every crashing wave. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. The lines between reality and nightmare thinned, blurring until I wasn't sure if what I saw was truth or the fevered imaginings of grief. Our small group, Henry, Sophie, Megan, and me, huddled in the old living room one stormy evening, the rain hammering the windows, the journal open on the coffee table between us. The photographs from the cave lay scattered around, their faded images haunting like ghosts trapped in time. "I can't believe all this was hidden here for decades," Megan whispered, tracing a finger over one photo. "Why would anyone keep this secret for so long?" Henry shook his head slowly. "Fear. Shame. Maybe they thought it was protecting the town, but it's only brought pain." I flipped through Claire's last entries, her words growing frantic and desperate. She wrote of meetings in the shadows, of whispers about a debt owed to the sea, and a growing fear that her fate was sealed. "Do you think she was marked?" Sophie asked quietly. "Marked to what?" I answered, my throat tightening. "To be taken," she said, "like the others in those pictures." The room grew heavy with unspoken dread. We all knew the stories. Ancient legends of sacrifices to the sea, of families cursed to lose their own. But this was something tangible, cruel, and real. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling like a mournful banshee. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Henry grabbed a flashlight and crept cautiously toward the entrance. He opened it to reveal a figure standing in the rain, a man in a dark coat, face obscured by the storm shadows. "I'm sorry to intrude," the man said in a low voice, "but I know the truth about what happened to Claire Whitmore." We stared at him, breathless. Was this the end or the beginning of a nightmare? The man stepped inside, his eyes sharp and calculating beneath the brim of a soaked hat. He introduced himself as Gabriel, an investigator who had spent years researching the maritime society the historian mentioned. They call themselves the Keepers, he said, voice barely above a whisper. A secret order guarding the balance between land and sea. They believe the ocean demands a price. Every generation, a sacrifice to keep the storms at bay and the tides steady. He laid out a tattered map, marking locations where disappearances had clustered for over a century. Claire's picnic spot was at the heart of it. But why her? I demanded, voice trembling. Gabriel hesitated. She uncovered something forbidden. A ritual hidden in the cave, one that could break the cycle. She wanted to expose them, to free the town from their curse. Henry clenched his fists. So they took her? Gabriel nodded grimly. They don't kill like we think. They take, but not always by force. Sometimes by choice. The sea calls them, and they answer. He pulled from his coat a small carved box, aged and sealed with a salt-stained rope. Inside was a collection of tokens, charms, shells, and, most chillingly, a pair of sandals. Our sandals, Sophie gasped, eyes wide with terror. Gabriel continued. The sandals Claire left on the beach weren't hers. They belonged to one of the keepers. A signal to anyone searching that the sacrifice had been made. A cold silence settled over us. Megan broke it. So, Claire, she didn't drown? She's still alive? Gabriel shook his head. No, she is part of the scene now, in a way we can't understand. The room felt suffocating, the storm outside intensifying. I felt the ocean's pull stronger than ever, as if the sea was reclaiming its due. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from the kitchen window. We spun around, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Outside, the waves lashed wildly, and on the shore, a figure stood, a woman with wild hair, soaked through, sandals missing, staring at us with eyes both familiar and strange. Claire! The woman crossed the threshold as if pulled by the storm itself. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, eyes shimmering like the surface of the ocean under moonlight. Claire! I whispered, stepping forward. She smiled, a haunting, otherworldly curve of lips. I am not what you remember. Henry's voice broke as he reached out. We never stopped looking for you. I am bound to the tide now, she said softly. The sea is both prison and sanctuary. The keepers took me, yes, but not to destroy, to protect a secret older than the town itself. She explained how the keepers guarded a sacred balance, an ancient pact between humans and the sea. Sacrifices weren't punishments. They were offerings to ensure survival. I wanted to break free, Claire said, to live again. But the sea, it is patient and unforgiving. Tears streamed down Sophie's face. Why the sandals facing the shore? Because I wanted you to know I came back, Claire whispered. That I'm still here, watching over you. The storm began to abate, the wind's fury softening to a gentle murmur. Claire's form shimmered, the edges of her body dissolving into mist. She looked at each of us with a sad, serene expression. Do not mourn me as lost, she said. I'm the tide's memory, the voice beneath the waves. Protect the secret, and the sea will protect you. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of salt and seaweed. The four of us stood in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling like a tide pulling back from shore. The mystery of Claire Whitmore had finally found its answer, not in death or disappearance, but in transformation. And though the sea claimed her, it left us a promise that love, like the tide, is eternal, shifting, powerful, and always returning.